The Wayfinding series brings ambitious and inspirational local creative professionals to campus to share their unique path towards a successful creative life. And I am so excited to have Jane Burke with us today to share her unconventional journey to her current role as the senior curatorial assistant for the Department of Textile Art and Fashion at the Denver Art Museum. In this role, Jane contributes to the research and development of curatorial projects, including exhibitions and publications, programming, acquisitions, and donor cultivation. Since arriving at the Dam in late 2013, Jane has worked on several stunning textile and fashion exhibitions, including Shockwave, Japanese Fashion Design, 1980s to 90s, Drawn to Glamour, Fashion Illustrations by Jim Howard, and Dior, From Paris to the World, which I'm sure many of you are still thinking about, like I am. And before landing at the Dam, Jane earned her bachelor's degree in fine art with an emphasis in painting from CU Boulder, and a master's degree in Asian art history and Chinese language from the University of Hawaii in Manoa. While in Hawaii, Jane gained more than 8 years of museum experience at both the Honolulu Academy of Arts and the Contemporary Museum, now known as the Honolulu Museum of Art. Jane is a sincere purveyor of thoughtful culture and great art, and I'm so happy to have her here to share her journey with us. Please welcome Jane Burke.
Thank you all so much for taking time out of your day to come. I'm really honored to be here, and I'm excited about this whole series because I was saying to Gretchen that it's such a benefit to hear from other people about the possibilities of what's out there, and so my talk is a little bit of a cycle. So you'll know a little bit about my path. I went from Colorado to Hawaii, back to Colorado. Most recently, and so I'm going to kind of go in a different rhythm and start with the end of the beginning. So I'll start and then sort of go back to the end again. So this is really sort of symbolic of the way that my talk is not linear. It's very circular and sort of reflective of my career path. This was just happenstance. I saw this exhibition title of a gallery in Paris, and so I really have no idea what it's actually referring to because I never went inside the gallery, but it's working for my purposes here. And I have to say that I'm much older than you may hopefully think that I am, and so I don't actually have very many photos from my undergrad and graduate years because it was a pre-Instagram world, and so a lot of my photos are sort of stock photos towards the end, but hopefully I'll make up for them with some other more recent photos. This is actually one of the few photos that I have from when I lived in Boulder before I went to Hawaii. This is just from a playground in North Boulder, and it was very prophetic though, because I went on to live in Hawaii for almost a decade. So it was a very influential period of my life. As Gretchen said, I went to CU Boulder, and actually, I probably shouldn't tell you, but I'm going to because this is the point of the talk. It took me actually 10 years to finish my undergrad degree because I never knew what to do. I always knew I wanted to pursue art, but I never knew in what facet. I think also I was always, kind of coveting fashion magazines and very much into high fashion since a young age. I would, sketch and do all those things, but I never knew exactly how to drive that passion and did not come from an artistic family. And I think that this was, part of why I want to talk to you is because I think when I was young, all I thought of, if you're in fashion, you have to be a fashion designer, not knowing there's, obviously a broad spectrum of jobs. Also, I ended up in the curatorial world. Again, I think in museums, you oftentimes just only think, oh, you have to be a curator to be in a museum. So I'm hoping to sort of dispel those myths and sort of talk to you about all the different kind of jobs and roles that exist within these fields. And you'll see that my path really makes no sense. So I hope that it gives you some inspiration. this is just a nod to Colorado, to my roots, and to what I'm, more or less calling the national, the state dress of Colorado. I think is, if we were to have a uniform, it might be a Patagonia fleece. This is also to talk about how I think, on the reverse side, as an audience member, the way that you think about fashion in museums has changed dramatically in the past 10 years. And so I think that that's also very indicative of how we think about art, how we've opened up what fine art means, the definition of, what constitutes as worthy of to be in a gallery. This is from a show that was staged at MoMA in New York. It was called Items Is Fashion Modern ? It was a playoff of a show that they had done decades earlier, and it featured 111 objects, mostly related to fashion, that were really transformative in the 20th and 21st century. So there were things like white t-shirts, Levi's 501s, the little black dress, things that we may not see as art, but they were really influential in their design and sort of their ubiquity in our culture today. So this is to say that I went from, Hawaii, and I actually studied Asian art history and somehow landed in the situation where I was able to assistant curate the Dior show, which I hope many of you were able to see. So really I want to just start there at the end of a beginning and talk about, the process of the making of Dior. I think that, it was obviously a very unique exhibition. It was one of the biggest exhibitions I think that the Denver Art Museum has put on in terms of production, scale, collaboration with the House of Dior. We collaborated with the set designers who came from an architecture firm in New York called OMA. So it's really interesting too, because I think people don't necessarily think about the set, what goes into the set design of exhibitions, which is becoming more and more of sort of a theatrical environment. And so that's, I think, an area where there is sort of a deficit. So I think people who are interested in architecture or spatial design, or, that's a really kind of still uncharted territory where there's not a lot of exhibition designers in the country, actually. And so that's why we did look to an architecture firm. And so they have just started doing more and more exhibitions. And so I think it's also interesting working with people who work, mostly on exteriors, right? But then to really work with interiors and actually objects, it was a really kind of experimental process with them, and trying to talk to them about, also fashion is very specific, it's very three-dimensional. It requires different things from 2D, obviously, that you're, you just need a wall essentially for. So this is a fashion photograph from Paolo Roversi. It was our sort of, token image for the exhibition. And this is the actual dress. So it's kind of fun to see. You see Gianfranco Ferré is the one who worked at Dior during the mid-90s when, before Galliano and before sort of the era of the supermodel. So he really kind of ushered in that real flamboyance at Dior. And so you can see that, it's just really fun to always look in fashion photography at the actual object. And this is a dress that's taken out of place of where it actually landed. This is, again, to say that part of the set design, we had a local woman, painter, who helped sort of give a nod or allusion to Versailles or the Galerie de Glace with these gold panels that we had in our 18th century section. And then here's the dress again and where it actually landed. And so this section was called The Garden. Again, this Gianfranco Ferré dress surrounded by Galliano's creations that he made for an exhibition on flowers. So there was a strong narrative with Christian Dior and sort of his house codes is what, I think you're familiar with that term. Really themes about flowers, about Versailles, about his connection to art, because he actually started as an art gallerist. So there's all of these codes that are embedded in the couture house that really we wanted to express through an exhibition to show people, again, that, these aren't just dresses. There's a really symbolism and a lot of layering of meaning that goes into these creations. And I think, again, going back to how fashion has become so popular in museums, I think is because of that, because these are, couture pieces which are unattainable for 99% of us. It's really fabulous to be able to see them up close. The majority of these dresses come from the Dior archive. So that's another component of fashion exhibitions that I think is really evolving, is that we're seeing more and more of these sort of luxury brands either keeping the dresses or buying them back. Literally, there's a woman at Dior whose job is just to search for dresses. She gets to comb eBay. She gets to look at fashion auctions and buy back Dior. And so, let's talk about dream jobs. So just to let you know. So that the exhibition at the Dam in Denver came actually as a form of an exhibition that the curator I worked with, Florence Mueller, she really presented the first iteration of it in Paris. And so it was really to honor the 70th anniversary of Christian Dior house. So he started in 1947, obviously in Paris, and it was inside MAD, which is in part of the Louvre. So it was a very epic moment, again, for fashion and to see Dior in the Louvre. And so I got to spend a fair amount of time studying the show there. So sorry for these photos, they're not great. But this was sort of the finale room. We had this dress, which is from the Egyptian collection of John Galliano. So you can kind of see, with traveling exhibitions, there's always this sense of sort of change, but still the themes were very much the same. So that last photo that I showed you with the Gianfranco Ferré dress, which was called The Garden, this was the version of The Garden in Paris. And so they actually contracted these visual artists from Barcelona, and they made all these cut flowers that they hung from the ceiling. So again, very collaborative. I think with all the exhibitions, there was always fine art, paintings that were sort of interwoven throughout each section. And, again, a lot of collaborative work from contemporary artists. This is to say how we in Denver then went to select the objects, because obviously the space, the Denver Art Museum, is very different than the architecture at the Louvre. And so we really had to adapt it. So this is a photo from the secret, which I can't mention, the secret location of where the Dior archive is. I can just say that it's massive and that they have to put them in different warehouses, because if one goes up in flames, they don't want all the John Galliano to go up in flames. So it's really a fascinating, I think, area as well. And so I think a lot of these luxury houses are literally archiving these collections and sort of for the auspice of making exhibitions and making these designer retrospectives to talk about the history of their house. This photo is a photo from one of Christian Dior's creations when he was still alive. It's from 1954. It's called Nuit de Chicago. It's actually from the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So we really had to kind of scour the country to look for, especially Christian Dior, because the Dior archive only starts really from John Galliano on. So at that time when John Galliano started, he wanted to archive all his couture. And so there's one representative of most every runway look. But when, Christian Dior's era, no one was thinking about exhibitions at that time. So it's not really that prevalent in collections. So we went to museums, and so these would have been passed down by the women who actually wore them. So a lot of socialites who, purchased Dior would have then given them to museums. So we worked with the Costume Institute at the Met. We worked with History Chicago. So there was a lot of socialites in the industrial era who were able to afford Christian Dior. And also, ironically, the Henry Ford Museum, because the Henry Ford, the wife, she was a huge Dior client. And it's really interesting because we got even in their archive and we looked at letters, and she'd written the couture house and had told Christian Dior, oh, that's a nice dress, but I want it in blue to look better for my complexion. So it's really fascinating because you can see sort of the lineage or the origin of how couture works. It's really made to measure. It's really for that woman, and that woman really, in you know, her case, she had a lot of authority, and she was actually a Firestone, so Firestone tires. So she was the Firestone, and then her daughter married into the Ford family. So talk about like a, you know, a conglomerate. So needless to say, all of their wardrobes are now at the Henry Ford Museum. And she had shoes in every color to match every dress. I mean, just an amazing collector. This is to speak about, again, how we integrated art, especially during the time that Christian Dior would have had a gallery in Paris, and he was very much into the surrealists of the time. So we were able to borrow this Dali bust that's just, you know, really incredible. There's only a few in the world. It was from a private collector in Spain. So that's part of my job, you know, sourcing where these objects are and then forming these relationships to beg and plead them to lend us their precious objects. This is the Christian Dior, his home, his childhood home. It is this color pink. I mean, it's a little bit filtered, but it is this bright pink. And so he, I think this is, you know, where they say his love of gardens came. It's in Normandy. It's actually right on the coast, and it's really beautiful. And they turned it into a historic house, a museum. So you can tour it, and really, it's mostly just during Christian Dior's era. So as you know, there's 7 artistic directors since in the history of the house, but this is really just to talk about the decade that Christian Dior designed. And so, you know, part of my job in the 2 years leading up to this exhibition was doing research like this and really finding out what the story is around the origins of the house and why these, you know, house codes came into being. And then here he is, Christian Dior himself. This is sort of how we got the theme of From Paris to the World. You know, he's looking at a globe. Christian Dior, again, is really, I think, seminal in the history of fashion because he was really the person who made the blueprint for what we think of luxury fashion today. His idea of branding, so when he first started, he started with, you know, not only the clothes, but also the perfume, makeup, accessories, I mean, all at the get-go. So you see all these brands, you know, and how they launch all these sort of, you know, sub-brands or even, you know, the accessory lines. But he really kind of had that foresight to know that he wanted to dress the total woman and really identify with a brand. So I think that part is really fascinating about his legacy. This is going back to sort of the set design. This is from that part of the exhibition that's the title, you know, the exhibition title's namesake. It's From Paris to the World. This, again, is the genius of OMA, the architects. So they made these metal platforms that are on wooden scaffolding. And so it was extremely, obviously, difficult to get the dresses up. If you guys have handled mannequins, these particular ones are a Japanese company called Aiwa that make these particular full-body mannequins, and they're not light. And these dresses aren't light. I mean, you can see how much, you know, and they come in like a body bag, like a Muslim body bag. That's how they travel. And so you can see, like, she had to get all the way up to the top. So you'll see her up here. So, I mean, this was like just an exhibition in and of itself to create. And then I think, you know, obviously the effect is worth it, but it took a lot of trial and error. And it was almost like a little bit treacherous to watch people. But it's primarily, you know, we have a whole team. We have a huge installation team that doesn't specify their sort of workload on the medium of art. They're really servicing all 10 departments that exist within the museum. And then we do have conservators on site. So we have, in our department, we have 2 textile conservators. One is sort of a permanent position, and the other is through a Mellon Fellow. So they get a fellowship for 2 years at the museum. And it's really, I mean, I think an incredible gift because, again, I think for as rare as textile departments are in the country, conservation jobs in the textile field are even rarer. And I mean, this is not to discourage you, but I think that it's a difficult field. I think there's a lot of people who go into more collections management and private practice because, again, when I'm mentioning a lot of these socialites who do have their own collections, that's another way you can kind of interface if you are interested in this aspect of you know, fashion and museum work particularly. One of our lenders was Hamish Bowles. He's an editor-at-large at Vogue, and he is really fascinating. He has an amazing collection of all designers, but a heavy amount of Dior, and he keeps his collection, you know, with two full-time collections managers in New York. So yeah, again, fascinating, these jobs that you never knew maybe existed. Another person that we had on our team who guest starred is Stephen Jones, the famous milliner who's worked historically with Dior. He started with John Galliano. They're both from London. And so he came in to actually mount the headpieces. This is from a Maria Grazia Curie, you know, one of her first collections after she arrived at Dior in 2016. This is from 2017. And then, you know, these are two more recent collections. And so we really integrated all 7 designers, which was hard. We had to do it in pretty much every section. This was just the section devoted to her. But we had, this dress came from 2018 and our show opened in 2018. So we were getting dresses, although we started 2 years in advance, we were getting dresses at the very last minute into our checklist, which is not so conventional. I think most curators want to have a very set list and they stick with that. And some curators, you know, work 7 years in advance if they have that luxury. And then this is just a photo from the opening. We had this amazing graphic designer who's local. His company is called McGinty. They really help to bring, you know, really bring the exhibition to life. You always want a great set designer and also a great graphic designer. If you have a catalog, you know, you always need another graphic designer for the exhibition catalog work. This was interesting because they were taken from the House of Dior, the actual couture house in Paris. He had this banister in the house that's pretty famous where he used to stage his original fashion shows. And so we did this composite of all of these ladies, you know, kind of posing on different places on this banister. And so some of the photos he had to like Photoshop in some of the dresses. It was really interesting. And I think another aspect of my job, we have support, but we also deal with a lot of image rights. That is probably not a glamorous job, but it's a very, very useful job that I think translates to so many different fields, not just in museums, but obviously in film work. I mean, you really have to go after the photographer, the model, sometimes the agency. So you're really going through this multi-layered process of getting the permissions to be able to, you know, present these things. So this is another photo from the Dior archive. They really are function as a museum essentially, and so this is to sort of speak about prior to going back into curatorial. I started in curatorial, then I went into collections management and registration, and collections management is just this. You are really driven by object numbers. The database is, you know, your right hand, and you're really working just to keep track of all of the objects. So it's really what it sounds like, collections management. So Dior has their own collections manager. She's tagging everything. So these objects came about 6 months in advance of the show because we did what we kind of informally call the colorama. So it's this, right? So this is the result of it. But this took so long because you can also see there's other jobs if you're having a more industrial hand. You know, welding is a huge part of, you know, and mount making is a huge part of a museum ecosystem. So every object, you know, always needs a mount, it needs a case. And in this case, we were lucky to have our mount maker make custom mounts for each object. So we would lay it out, the composition, and then, you know, the weight is just crazy. Like the scarab brooch, I don't know how actually a woman could wear it because like she would just be tilted forward, I think, because it's just an extreme amount of weight. These are sunglasses. It's a collaboration with Rihanna. So it was made in, obviously, you know, these are sort of a mixture of all designers, and clearly the themes were based on the colors. This is, again, a headpiece by Stephen Jones. So this part was really fun to just really show the breadth of what Dior, you know, was the history of Dior. And then, you know, these little miniatures, I don't know if anybody remembers those, but they were little miniatures. So the dresses, and there's someone who just keeps track of the miniatures, because the miniatures often get their own exhibitions because they're so adored. And you can see why, because there was a history of it that they made them because they would be able to travel easier than the full-size dresses. So if you had a client, say, you know, and you're still traveling by boat back in the day, you know, they can put these in a trunk and show the client, here's this dress I'm going to make for you. And oftentimes they say that these are worth more than the full-size dress because it's harder to make in miniature. So if you can think about the scale that you have to operate at, and also the materials, you know, you're making everything literally perfectly to scale. So that just was a fun part of this show. Like this one, for example. This one is called Juno. It's a famous dress. A lot of the dresses up until, I think, probably Raf Simons, all have names. So the house they all have like pet names. It's a little bit funny. Anyway, this dress is called Juno, and yeah, she's probably worth the same amount of a full-size dress. So yeah, this is, you know, many, many, many hands at work to create this. And then this is just to show you what you know, a packaged dress looks like in transport. This is the big Egyptian gold dress. I don't know if you remember. I could maybe go back to see. So it's this guy, and it's really crazy because it's like a top with these balloon arms, and then a skirt, but it's all plated metal. So to be able to transport it, I mean, I don't know how much tissue they use. It's not environmental. But they come in these crates, and I think for Galliano, if you're a fan of, you know, Galliano, you know that they're massive. And I remember going through one crate at the archive, and he literally made this dress out of like, you know, a rubber raft, like if you go down the river in a raft, it was that material. So we couldn't even lift it out of the crate because it was so heavy. And so it's given me a new appreciation for fashion models, because a lot of these are not easy to wear, and you know, they're in high heels. They have to have zero expression. So that was really an interesting part. Speaking of zero expression, these are the different types of mannequins that we used. And I think, again, you know, if you're a fashion student, this is interesting. These are the traditional ones they use in the atelier, right? They're called Stockman, is the kind of Parisian brand name of what, you know, dressmaker forms. This, again, is the Iowa. They have different names. There's Kofrad also makes a version. There's also, sometimes they call them schleppies. If anybody saw the Yves Saint Laurent exhibition, I did not live here at this time, but they used a lot of schleppies for that. And then these ones are really interesting because they're made out of this thing called Foss shape, and I don't know if any of you are familiar with Foss shape, but essentially it's like a heat-sensitive felt, and so you can sculpt. So we call these invisible forms because you're literally sculpting it to the silhouette of the dress so that you don't see that there's a body underneath. And so I'll just, because I'm having fun with the clicker, I'll go back to the beginning. Let's see. So like this would have been made with that invisible form, and you know, this whole section. Foss, F-O-S-S. And it's a fairly new technology that people are experimenting. I think they're continually making it better, but I know that a lot of museums are using it. So I definitely will go a little bit faster, but you know, this is, again, if you're a fashion student, I think it's interesting to see. So we hired people, locals, people to work with the Dior team to do the underdressing. So with these volume of dresses, you know that they can't just hang on a mannequin alone by themselves. They need a lot of help to look like there's an actual body underneath. So, here, you're adding a lot of chest and butt usually, because the mannequins are not really representative of a real woman's body. So it's a lot of that. This is, again, to say this is our chief of installation who just recently retired. But, this was a very complex thing that the set designer said, okay, let's make, these are toiles, so they're really the pattern, right? You're making the pattern of the dress in this muslin, this cheap muslin, before you use the fabric, and then you're going back and taking it apart, and that's how you're making the pattern, for those of you not in the fashion design program. And so this was sort of the composition that we tried to do. This was a wall that curved. So again, not easy. So a lot of problem solving, again, a lot from our installation team, our map making team, to make these sort of metal pipes that you see. So they're kind of curving out and under, and then they're using the hole that naturally exists where the post, where the tripod would usually be for the stockman. So again, a lot of problem solving. I think when you have a lot of ambition, then you have to be able to really be able to meet it with problem solving. So then this exhibition went to Dallas. And so I helped to kind of steward all of the loans and the looks, and was really, again, the liaison from the Dior house to Dallas. And so this was their version. We had the same architects, but obviously a very different museum. The Denver Art Museum, Daniel Liebskin made a very unique gallery environment that's not translatable to most other institutions. And so this is a huge barrel vault at the the Dallas Museum of Art, if anybody's ever been there. So this was their version of From Paris to the World, and then this was their section of ladies in Dior. So different. And then this is the way they did their sections of designer moments. So this is, again, Maria Grazia Curie. So different set design than what we had. This is their version of the colorama. And then this is really speaking my part about my job that, is good and bad. But in order for these exhibitions to happen, you need donors, right? These exhibitions are not cheap. And so before we even started this exhibition, we, with the arrival of Florence, who's Parisian and has all these connections, we brought a group of donors to Paris and were able to tour the house in Paris. And so, I mean, yeah, I think I'm not feeling sorry for myself, but you do have to realize there is a heavy amount of hand-holding that goes on these trips. So, but amazing experiences. This is the sort of sitting room inside. If you were a couture client, or a celebrity, this is where they go for their fittings. So now I'm going to skip ahead, and I'll go maybe faster because I don't have much time. But this is Jim Howard. I don't know if anybody saw the exhibition. He is local now. He formerly was in New York, and he worked during a period of time really from the 50s to the 80s, again, when fashion illustration was really popular, and you would see it. You guys are, well, some of you are not, but some, if you're familiar with the advertising in mostly newspapers, but now it's dominated by fashion photography. But prior, it was all, these illustrations. These are Xerox copies because I went through his archives, so he had probably 500 sketches that he kept through his career, because really the newspapers only needed the copy, right? And then he kept the original for the most part. And so I got to go through his original archive, and then we were just sort of playing with the placement. And so for this exhibition, I did a lot of research on the history of American department stores, because that's what it's relating to. He started in Texas at Neiman Marcus, went on to do Saks Fifth Avenue, Bonham's, Bonwit Taylor, some that you may not know, except for Bonwit Taylor's and the Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. Anyway, so then this is, what it looks like. We framed all of the illustrations. He has a very, realistic style, but really a very definitive kind of his own. I think the other kind of illustrators from his period are much more gestural. He is really unique, I think, in his attention to detail. I love how in this one you can't see from where you are, but there's a reflection of like a man standing in a pool and the sunglasses. I mean, details like that you don't necessarily get in the same effect with fashion photography. So I think it's a lost art form. We blew up some of his photos to be vinyl. So again, our installation team helped us. This is what it looked like. It was really fun to see them in the scale. We used a few dresses from our own collection to kind of invoke that era. Again, we wanted to play with the idea of a department store window. This is very like Mad Men era. That's what it's supposed to sort of express. And then this time around, we wanted to incorporate menswear because oftentimes, people are like, but what about the men? So we brought in, we don't have any in our permanent collection, but then again, we went out and sought local stylish men, asked them to borrow their suits, and they let us. So this is a Pierre Cardin suit. And then this is the result. This is like 2 graphics that were mashed together. This kind of looks like the young Yves Saint Laurent. So it was fun to incorporate menswear, and then as a result of borrowing these as loans, they eventually gifted them to the museum. So now we have started a small collection of menswear. So this exhibition was the first that I worked on with Florence. It came really sudden because we don't have like the most robust collection to draw from. So a lot of the exhibitions we do are based on loans. So this one came about because Florence had gone to a fashion auction. So this is another job. You can work at auction houses, and there's a lot of auction houses that are very specific to fashion. This one happens to be in Paris. It's called Art Curiel. Every year they do an auction, I think it's in October, just based on Japanese fashion designers, which is fantastic. So this was really kind of the foundation of this exhibition that we had this idea to do about the influence of Japanese designers in the late 80s and 90s. So you think Comme des Garçons, Yohji Yamamoto, these Kansai, Kenzo, all of these designers. So again, starting the process, you kind of gather from all over what you can get from where. We literally made cold calls to people that we thought might have these in their closet. This is from my godmother in Hawaii, this dress, so it's really scrappy. Like, I think people think, oh, an exhibition is just like falls from the sky, like the objects just like appear. But it's really a really different type of process that you don't think about, and especially with fashion because it's literally going into people's closets. And like, and then once they go in the museum, they're treated so precious. And like, they're like, oh, that was on my floor like 10 minutes ago. So I think it's a really unique kind of part of fashion. And this is a great, we used some architecture, design, graphic departments, objects. This is a chair from Nendo. It's a Japanese chair called the Cabbage Chair. It's literally, again, kind of using a similar technique as Issey Miyake and his Pleats Please. They're like rolling the fabric. In this case, it was like heat sealed, same process as Issey Miyake, and then rolled up like sushi, cut, and then fanned out. So it's fun, again, to make those connections. I think fashion especially has a really large umbrella to kind of envelop all of these other arts, fine art, furniture, film, what have you. So for this exhibition, we also worked with LACMA in LA. We borrowed this futon. It literally looks like a futon, right? But it's a jacket from Issey Miyake. We also went to the Diong Museum. I think being on the West Coast, they had a lot more women at the time who were wearing Japanese designers. This is a Kansai look. It's amazing. It has some applique snakeskin. It's just like a beautiful, beautiful piece. And then again, beg, borrowing, and stealing. And then, we had the fortune of being able to sort of match, this is a Comme des Garçons dress that we were able to get the original fashion show from footage. And this was really hard. Again, Florence was like, I know this woman who used to work there. And then this woman in Japan found it in somebody's like apartment who happened to be moving out, and she had these VHS tapes. I mean, the random ways that you are able to kind of unearth, because you're kind of an excavator, right? Like, it's a real interesting process. And then this is a famous bump dress, again, by Comme des Garçons. And this is for the catalog photography. So again, if you're doing photography. Object photography is huge in museums. I think we just put out a call to hire a new one. So another kind of job if you're into photography. I'd say also, Gretchen can attest to this, but like practicing artists always want their work photographed. So I think, you know, a lot to be said. This again is going back to, we have this installation team that's sort of broken up, and some people just do the art, you know, the actually art handling, and others really make the fabrication of the platforms and the backdrops. Here you can see him working, again, you know, working on image rights to be able to make the graphics. This is the final installation, what it looked like. And again, you know, we're just really fun. This is a Cindy Sherman photograph. She, you know, obviously does, you know, self-portraiture, but she's wearing this dress then that we had. And so again, I think it's just really fun to always use, you know, multiple mediums to express an idea. This is a dance performance by Merce Cunningham, and they did this dance performance that actually, where Ray Kawakobo of Comme des Garçons designed the costumes for the dance. This is what our gallery looks like with just the platforms. This is what it looks like without the platforms. And so this is just to speak on, again, this is the conservation studio. This is where they're working to either work on fashion, or we also have flat textiles. This is an education space that we have. It's called the Thread Studio. It's all under construction, but will reopen soon. And so it's a great opportunity for us to work with the local community. So we do want to reach out to all of you to have opportunities for you to work inside the museum and to showcase what you guys are working on. This is a friend of mine, and so, you know, again, we don't just have to show fashion. She was influenced by tapestry and made a painting based on the tapestry that she saw. Speaking of tapestry, so when I first came to the Dam, I was hired by a curator who preceded Florence, whose specialty was in 18th century tapestry. So very different from where Florence is. So I would say maybe they were the polar opposites. So again, I think I had this strange versatility to be able to, you know, I've always loved fashion. I've never actually studied it formally, but somehow by like this grace of God, I got, you know, to work with this, you know, preeminent fashion curator. And then, you know, our collection at the Dam is mostly known for, we have an amazing Chinese robe collection, quilts, which is, you know, an American favorite. And then we also have, you know, contemporary fiber artists, Olga D'Amaral, she's a pretty well-known Colombian artist. We share a lot of objects with other departments. So we have an Ancient Americas department, Asian department, contemporary art department. So we all kind of collectively make joint acquisitions with each other if it applies. I'm gonna run through the last because I think I have 5 minutes left. So this is just to say, going backwards again to the beginning of the end. I've lost track of which beginning and end I'm at, but this is Hawaii. If you've never been, it's really paradise, and this is to show that it actually was a paradise for a woman named Doris Duke. She was a billionaire heiress in the 20s. She went around the world and decided after her honeymoon that she was going to collect Islamic art and ended up accumulating 40,000 objects. So this place is called Shangri-La for a reason. It's literally right on the most beautiful part of beach in kind of Waikiki. This is her house, this is her pool house. I show that just because I worked at the Honolulu Museum of Art. If you ever go there, you can buy a ticket to tour her house. So it's just like an amazing perk of working at the museum. This is, these are stock photos since I have no photos from this area. But this is the art department building at UH Manoa. It's one of the most beautiful campuses, again, just because you have this lush greenery. There's like a bamboo forest inside, so your studios are up here and you're just surrounded by, you know, foliage. So it's just a really special, unique place. And I actually studied the Asian studies. So this is a Korea Center. It's one of the first, you know, Asian-centric study centers outside of Asia. And then one of my first jobs while I was in grad school was at the East-West Center. And the East-West Center is this federally funded organization that promotes international relations, specifically between Asia and the US. So they have a gallery where I worked, and so it was a very interesting experience because I worked mostly with a curator who was very anthropologically minded. So you were literally doing exhibitions that were related to, very like everyday kind of common topics. It was not necessarily talking about high art, but you were just trying to talk about, the people and the cultures. And this is a Thai sala, a pavilion that, just to say kind of the type of exhibitions they worked on there, we were able to rebuild. It had originally been built in the 80s, and then because of the weather had sort of become eroded, and so got funding from the Thai government and the king and the queen, blessing this project. And so, just being able to collaborate a lot internationally with Asian countries was really the impetus of why I wanted to be in Honolulu, because it really is the bridge between Asia and the US. To go back to my studies of how really I got even the chance to be in the textile world is because I loosely based my thesis on sort of one of the points when I left school, and I spent 2 years more or less backpacking around Asia, and I landed in this little tiny village in Yunnan province, which is in the southwestern part of China. And while I was backpacking and really had no clue still as to a career, I happened upon all these village women who were making these incredible embroideries, and I just fell in love, and I didn't really know what to do with it at the time. I tried to have sort of an import-export company. I tried to learn Mandarin and really, go back and make clothing. And I remember I had a tutor one time who told me, you have to have a metal heart. And I was like, no, I don't want a sweatshop. Like, that's not what I'm going for here. But that's really, I think that this was this way. I've always really looked at fashion through an anthropological lens, through a sociological lens. And so it's really fun for me to be able to kind of have those worlds align now. And I think high fashion totally relates to, minorities living in China. And so, my thesis is really about like the representation of them and their identity. So I really am interested in identity politics and how we use fashion or costume to communicate our identity, right? So at the end of the day, I think that's what fashion is doing for all of us. We're able to express ourselves through this way. And so it is this art form that everybody can access, and I think that's why it's so popular, right? Because we all feel like artists when we're, relating to our clothing, to our wardrobe. And so you never know when I'm going to come and call you and ask for that thing in your closet. This again is Honolulu. This is inside the East-West Center Gallery. This is an exhibition I worked at when I worked at the Honolulu Museum of Art that was really pivotal. I got the chance to go to Bhutan and work with monks who were really, again, the Kingdom of Bhutan allowed us to bring out their sacred objects. So Bhutan is all Buddhist, and so their objects are prayed to every day, essentially. So they would hold pujas. So they sent all these monks for the duration of the exhibition who every day had to pray to the objects. And so we became very good friends, so we went and hung out at the beach. This is just an iconic object from the Honolulu Museum of Art, which is really, I feel like, where I grew my museum legs, and it really feels like a home to me. This is a Guanyin statue from the Asian Art Department. Again, they have a really strong Asian collection, again, because of their proximity. The museum was actually founded in 1927, and a lot of the objects came because at the time, China was going through, a lot of turmoil in East Asia, and so a lot of the objects came from, gambling debts. People are just trading art to get out of debt. And so, again, I think that this is this misnomer of how museums start and how collections start, and you never know kind of the path of how things come into being. So I think it's just, this is a picture from the Bhutan exhibition, and then I got to work on a lot of contemporary Asian art exhibitions. This is one of my favorite artists, Xu Bing. This is the outside of the museum. This is, so it's complicated. When Gretchen was saying, so there was 3 museums I worked at. This is the Encyclopedic Museum. This is representative of the yard of the Contemporary Museum where I worked, their Sculpture Garden, and this was a school. And now they're all one, but before they were sort of different entities, and I worked at all three, and I literally went from here to here to here to back to here. So it's very, you know, and I think it's similar in Colorado. You know, there's only so many institutions. If you want to stay in an institution, there's only so many. So you kind of have this musical chair effect, I think, when you're doing that. This is the view from this is the Contemporary Museum. Again, a pool. Every museum in Honolulu has a pool. Just kidding. This is David Hockney did this little installation inside this little house. I mean, it's a really special place, and unfortunately, they just sold the property. This is, again, a sculpture in the garden, Tom Musselman. We had an exhibition of his at the Dam not too long ago, and it was fun because they showed in the Denver Art Museum presentation the maquette of this sculpture that actually lives in Honolulu. I worked as a collections manager and registrar for an exhibition we did on tattooing. I mean, again, I think that I've just had a really broad scope of exhibitions that haven't just been fashion focused. So I think that's always good, that you never know, like, even if you think that, oh, I am just a fashion student, I think fashion especially lends itself to really being kind of an all-encompassing medium. This is where my office was in here when I worked in the Honolulu Museum of Art. This is our collection. This is an incredible piece made out of pineapple fiber. I don't know if anybody knew that you can actually make really fine threads from a pineapple specific to the Philippines. And then this is really a mural, a painting that lives in the airport of the Honolulu airport, and it's by Peggy Hopper, and this is just to symbolize the end of my career in Honolulu. And then this is really just to tell you guys, like, my talk is to just remind you that, like, it all works out somehow. I don't know how, but that, you know, you really, you know, you can try as much as possible to really navigate. But I often envy people who have this idea that they have this plan. But even then, you know, I console myself, like, it doesn't always work out the way that you think it will. So thank you guys for your time.
So great, right? Oh my gosh. I know some of you may have to run to class, but Jane will stick around for a little bit. So if your schedule allows, please stick around and chat a little bit more. I just want to invite you to our next Wayfinding event. So we'll be gathering back here in the library on March 12th. And we'll be hosting a panel discussion called The Naked Body. So you don't want to miss out. Neely Patton, our Senior Vice President of Academic Affairs, will be joined with Amber Cobb, Head of Fine Arts and Foundations, Irene McRae, Faculty Emeritus from Fine Arts, and Scott Wakefield, our Chair of Illustration. We'll all be talking about historical, personal, kind of all the different contexts that the naked body appears in the art and design and culture world. So that'll be fun. And then reminder to students, you still have the weekend to apply to submit your work for the student exhibition. So Monday is the last chance to do that. It's the 57th annual student exhibition. It's a really great honor to get into the exhibition. It's a really important tradition for the college. So if you haven't yet, please apply and submit your work. We have Rob Evans in the back here. If you have questions, you can chat with him or ask me or talk to your department chair of how to submit. Okay? Thanks again for coming. Thank you so much, Shane. You're fantastic. Have a great rest of your week, everybody.